So the French Revolution begins in the summer of 1789, and it begins as a result of a couple of key things, right? The first major thing that brings about the Enlightenment is about the French Revolution is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is this period of European history, or at least transatlantic history, because it affects both France, Europe in general, Britain, obviously, and then it spreads to the Americas, North America, particularly the United States, and then obviously down into the Latin America and the Caribbean. The Enlightenment is this intellectual movement that focuses on liberalism. It focuses on the desire of the individual people to have liberty, rights of the individual. And the French are experiencing a lot of problems that put those two things at odds, and we'll talk about that in just a second. You also have a massive debt in France. France is experiencing a period of huge economic turmoil. The upper classes of France don't pay much taxes. We'll talk about that in a second. There is a huge amount of deficit because of the American Revolution. And there's a lot of problems going on economically for France. They are also using something called mercantilism, which you probably would have heard about in other courses. So the French are experiencing huge problems. This is all exacerbated by the fact that France is still experiencing something called the estates system. The estates system was a system that was put into place in France under the feudal system, where you have three classes, right? The monarch is at the top, right? The monarch is the king, King Louis XVI at this time. But below the king, there are three estates. The first estate is the Roman Catholic clergy. Now, I should point out, this is all men, and it's also a small selected group of people, right? They are only about 1% of the population, but they control something like 30% of all the land. And because we are living in a period, in the 18th century, land is really the only source of capital people really have at this time. So the church has a lot of power, a lot of money. Along with that, they also collect a tax. They collect a 10% tax called the tithe, Tithe, from the entire population, Catholic or not. Below them is the nobility, the second estate. These are the aristocrats. Now, they are both men and women. They're a small percentage of the population, about 2% of the population. So they are, again, a very closed group of people, very wealthy group of people. Below them, you have the third estate. The third estate is a large group of people, about 97% of the population. At the top, you have a group called the bourgeoisie, who are your wealthier people. Now, they're not nobles, they're not priests, they are wealthy, they have a lot of money, but they are a relatively small group of population, right? They're about 5 to 7, at most 10% of the population. They're your educated people. They are wealthy, they're merchants, they're lawyers, doctors, educators. They are people who have a good amount of cash. But they're also the people who have read their Enlightenment. They have read their John Locke, their Immanuel Kant, their Rousseau, the Voltaires, all of Montesquieu, all of those names that you may have heard of and you might have read about. They're the ones who are well versed in this. Below them, you have the city workers. Probably, again, about 10 to 15% of the population, not a terribly large group of people, but they are wealthier than the peasants, but they're still living sort of paycheck to paycheck in some cases. Below them are the peasants. These are your farmers, your poor tenant farmers who have really no money and are really the ones who are most affected by so much of these struggles. In May of 1789, King Louis XVI calls the entire Estates General together. Now, the Estates General is kind of the closest thing that the French have to a parliament. It's a meeting of a meeting of the representatives of the three estates, and the purpose of this meeting is to try and figure out the problems of France, get more money flowing in France, and fix the economy. This meeting starts in May of 1789, and by June of 1789, the third estate is really annoyed, right? They can't They cannot agree with whatever the third estate cannot get the first and second estate to agree with them. They're not being listened to. So finally, in June of 1789, the third estate leaves and they create what is called the National Assembly. Now it's interesting that they call themselves the National Assembly, right? They are assembled to represent the nation. And they pledge a tennis court oath, and the oath is, we are not going to stop meeting until we have a constitution, until we limit the power of the king. In July of 1789, July 14th, you have the first act of violence, the real first piece of aggression being taken out, which is the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was the king's prison in Paris, and a group of the National Assembly target this prison, and they release prisoners. It's a big mess. It's a first show of violence, but it shows the king that you're not going to really just walk in here and win. Finally, in August of 1789, the National Assembly releases the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This document, which I have provided for you as part of your assignment, lays out sort of the goals of the French Revolution. We want more liberty, right? It's really a great Enlightenment document, right? If you look at it's a much larger document than the one I've given you, but the first piece of it, says men are born and remain free and equal. It's really this document trying to pledge solidarity, pledge acceptance. So it's a great document. Now, once that comes to an end, 1789, 1790, there are other changes that happen in this period. There's a civil constitution of the clergy that limits the power of the church. They change the flag. The National Assembly gets a little bit more power. They create a constitution. And in 1792, they bring the constitution to the king. And through a series of events, which I'm not going to go into detail about, the king ultimately winds up fleeing. He flees, he's arrested, and he is brought back to Paris. Then he's put on trial for treason. And while that's going on, ultimately he's found guilty. And in January of 1793, King Louis XVI is ultimately beheaded by the people of Paris, the people of France. Once that happens, there becomes sort of everybody's looking over their shoulders, right? So the leaders of the French Revolution organize something called the Committee on Public Safety, and they start to really crack down on the revolution, right? They really want to try and weed out any enemies of the revolution. So for the next couple of months, there's a lot of targeting going on, a lot of assaults going on people who are seen as against the revolution. This all leads to something called the Reign of Terror. The Committee on Public Safety, which is this group aimed at releasing or getting rid of the people who are against the revolution, start targeting priests, nobles, anybody with former authority. And in this 9-month period, roughly 30,000 people are killed. And that works out to something like 100 people a day over this 9-month period. It becomes a really gruesome phase of the French Revolution. And they are using the guillotine, right? So the guillotine is this apparatus here. It's swift. It takes off the person's head, which was a death or an execution style that was previously reserved only for the nobility because it was seen as quick and painless, while the poor and the underclasses would receive a lot of more painful experiences, being burned at the stake, drawing and quartering, being hung. But the guillotine was this great democratizer, right? Everybody was equal in their death. So in February of 1794, Robespierre, the leader of the National Assembly, the leader of the Reign of Terror, comes in and he gives a speech to say that what we're doing here in the Reign of Terror is essential because it is virtuous. It is a good thing. It is spreading democracy. It is giving people a voice. It's a thing of liberty. We are getting rid of those institutions that are keeping away your freedoms. Now, his justification, as you can see here in the 3 paragraphs I give you, again, it's a longer document that I've edited down. You can see that he's arguing for better treatment, and obviously the outcome of that may be different. By July of 1794, the Reign of Terror has come to an end. The people of France start to have quiet brought back into their cities, into their country. And then there needs to be healing. Maximilian Robespierre himself, winds up being guillotined in July of 1794. In 1795, the government is reformed. The National Assembly has now become the National Convention, and they establish a new directory. The directory is a 5-person executive branch, and anybody who has studied anything about government knows that this is completely ineffective, right? You can never get 5 people to agree on anything. So this is something that's really ineffective, and ultimately what winds up happening is Napoleon Bonaparte, the person who I'm sure we all know from history, winds up orchestrating a coup in 1799 and having himself declared the first consul of France. And ultimately, by 1804, he becomes the emperor of France, Napoleon I. So by the time the French Revolution has come and gone, you have these great liberal ideas of democracy and independence and representation of the people sort of going too far. And ultimately, by 1804, you're back where you began. You have an emperor. Now, tomorrow we will talk more about Napoleon, and we will look at sort of was Napoleon sort of the exact opposite of the Enlightenment, or did he incorporate ideas of the Enlightenment? But again, we'll talk more about that again.